name is Matthew Leopold. I look after insight and brand here at LexisNexis, and today we're going to dive into the details of prompting. Hopefully you're going to come away today with a really solid understanding as to what prompting is and how you can up your prompting game. We're going to be talking very specifically about prompting for legal purposes. So if you're coming here today wanting to write a poem or a sonnet in the style of Boris Johnson, you're going to be disappointed. We are going to talk particularly about the utilization of prompting in LexisNexis's generative AI solution, Lexis AI. And we're going to use this as an example because it is the tool that we know best, and it's a tool that we can be very confident that it will meet the standards that we expect. But of course, the techniques that we're going to teach you, that we're going to share with you today, are transferable across other generative AI tools and other large language models. So we're going to talk a little bit with a smidge of theory and then dive into some real life examples of prompting using a real life generative AI tool, Lexis AI. Sounds good, I hope. It's commonly thought that generative AI solutions don't need training. You just don't need to use training to be able to use them because they are so simple. You can just use them straight out of the box. And you know what? That is completely true. However, like most things in life, to get the best quality answer or to maximize efficiency, just a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of training, particularly in this case on prompting, can make a huge difference. This skill is often described as prompt engineering, but honestly, I think that's a really unhelpful term because prompting is basically programming a computer, but it's using natural human language, or English in our case. And if you're able to write clear instructions, provide some context, you can prompt engineer. So don't get worried or frightened about that big term. And certainly today we're pitching this both for those that have very little understanding, but also for those that have a little bit of understanding to make it a little bit more legally context. Not quite right. You know what I mean. Let's take a slightly broad example. If you go into a library and you ask the friendly librarian for a book, they will look at you like you're stupid and then passively aggressively pass you a book. So you'll get a book, but it might not be the book you're looking for. It might be a book by Jeffrey Archer. But if you narrow things down a little bit and say, can I have a crime book? Then at least you've told the librarian the sort of book you're after. They'll be able to go to the right part of the library, to the right bookshelf, and pass you something more suitable. If we narrowed it down even further with like the name of the author or the type of crime, then you're going to get a better fitting book for your needs. And that essentially is what a prompt does. You're telling the large language model what it is you want it to do. The more specific and clearer the direction, the better. And rather than getting books back in our library example, you're getting words or pixels back. And that basically is what we're going to talk about today. And I'm really delighted to be joined by two internal experts here at LexisNexis. We're joined by Kate O'Carroll. Kate is from our customer success team. She's had 13 long years of experience at LexisNexis, and her job in essence is about helping our customers to maximize their value from the Lexis products. So she's really, really good at helping people understand how to make Lexis AI work to their needs. Before she was at Lexis, she was at Pinsent Masons, delivering research and training, so has a really, really strong understanding of delivery. I'm also joined by Heidi Hassan. Heidi is going to regret the fact that she sent me her biography just a little bit too late, because when I tell you that she's an expert crocodile wrestler and is currently training her pet gorilla to sing, you'll realize that I am lying. Heidi actually has 15 years of criminal defense experience, and she works in our data discovery and enrichment team and has a really detailed knowledge of Lexis AI and AI in general. So I'm really thrilled to have these two experts joining us on the call today. If you do have any questions, please feel free to back them into the questions section, and we will do our very best to come to those through the rest of the call. But that's enough from me. So over to Heidi, please take us away. Let's pull up the slides. There we go. Heidi.
Thank you, Matthew. Hi, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here today and able to talk to you about some of the things that me and my team do. I forgot how to do the slides. Right, okay. What what I'm going to talk to you about is a little bit about what my team does and why that's important to start with. And then I'm going to take you through a little bit of context and a few really high-level things to think about when you are doing your prompts, because there's a lot that you need to understand, but only at a very high level, so that you can really get the most out of the product before we delve into the real specifics. So who are my team? Data discovery and enrichment. It doesn't really tell you an awful lot. It's a bit of a strange name for a team in some ways. We are a group of qualified lawyers, huge diverse practice background there. So to reassure you that there are real lawyers working with the data teams to develop these products as they go along. I, for example, as I was introduced, I've got a criminal defence background, also in academia, and I sit for the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal. So quite a wide spectrum, and among my team that is replicated. So we do our very best to put ourselves in your shoes and help the team develop something that really suits you. And the way we do that is we design and implement evaluations for the model as it goes through development to become the product that you use in the end. And we do that by reflecting as much as we can the different customers that will use it and the different intents that they'll have in different ways of use. And then we pass that back to our data partners. We work with them to develop new features. And there's a lot of work that goes along in that space, as you would expect, for something as big as this. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of context so you understand when you put your prompt in, what's going on behind the scenes and how the model is using that. Okay. So just for the real basics, for anyone that doesn't know, Lexis AI is another way to interact with our content. So it uses all the same content that we've got on Lexis+, but it uses it in a different way. So you can put, rather than going in and searching, you can put a nice little prompt in, longer, shorter, depends on your needs, depends on your time, your appetite for doing that. And it will go out and it will bring you something back that is bespoke to what you want. I'm sure you've heard the terms extractive and generative before. Extractive is where a model brings back content and it gives it to you as is. So it's word for word, basically. Generative takes that a bit further and gives you something bespoke. So it writes to you in natural language, so English for us, for this product. And it can do quite a lot of things. So it can answer your question, that's probably the most obvious one, but it can draft letters, it can draft arguments, it can do quite sophisticated things. So before we can understand your user prompts, we need to know a little bit about the thinking process, if I can call it that, a bit colloquially for the model. I'm going to go through this on a really, really high level. There are lots more bits and pieces that we haven't got time to go through. Essentially, when you put your prompt in, the model breaks that down into something that it can use. It detects your intent. So do you want an argument? Do you want a letter? Do you want an answer? It detects things like jurisdiction, and then another bit of the model goes out into that content and brings back snippets, so bits of information. That is then sort of filtered down to the most suitable ones, and that is presented to the LLM, which is the large language model that actually writes the output, and it uses that to ground the output that it gives you, meaning everything that it includes comes from our content with link citations that you can, of course, check. But that is presented to the LLM embedded in something we call back-end prompts. So there are two types of prompts. So the prompts that you put in, but by the time it receives those, or just after it receives that, it gets a whole load of other prompts that you don't see. So back-end meaning like backstage, because you don't see it. So it's important that you understand that they are there, because that informs the sort of decisions you make about your own user prompts. So, I'm going to set the slide here. There we go. So back-end prompts are a set of instructions that the model is given so that it can decide, if I can use that word, what to put in its output for you. And they differ slightly depending on the task. So it's given different instructions if you want a letter than if you want an argument, for example. And they tell it essentially what it can use, so our content that we present to it with them, and how it can use it. So it also contains some quite specific instructions where that's appropriate. So a good one to give as an example is the use of UK terminology and spelling. So for example, don't use attorney, use solicitor for the UK. And that cuts down a lot of the work that you would otherwise have to do. If you were to go onto the internet at large now and say, how do I write an AI prompt? It would tell you to do a lot of work, actually, to get the best out of it. It would tell you, you need to give the AI a persona. So it needs to know it's writing as a lawyer. You need to tell it who the audience of the output is. Is it writing a letter to a client? What does that look like? What is a client? And it needs to give it limits. So how long, what it can include, what sort of output it should be. But there are limits to what we can put in those back-end prompts. One of the big reasons being that we don't know exactly what you are going to be asking. So we can't go in really specific because we've got lots of different customers that ask for lots of different things in those outputs. Also, something that you might not have thought of is that the AI does get overwhelmed. So from development exercises, we've processes, we understand that there's a real sweet spot to how much to put in what we tell the model. So we don't want to overwhelm it with lots and lots and lots of content in those prompts, because to describe it in a way as though it's a human, it won't read all of it. So we need to keep it quite high level and be really, really sort of discriminate about what we put in those back-end prompts. So why does this matter to you? Well, it cuts down a lot of work that you have to do, because when you put your prompt in, you can be confident that the model has already been given examples. It understands what we mean by a letter to a client, for example. It understands how to write as a lawyer, but there are still things that you need to bear in mind with your prompt. So the first and really obvious one is that it needs clear instructions. If you put in a prompt that's quite ambiguous, and there are lots of different ways it could interpret it, you're probably not going to get back exactly what you want. It's recoverable. You can have a conversation with the model and refine what you want, but the clearer you can be, the better. But another issue that we have is that the model takes things really literally, and that can be a strength, but it can also, if you're not careful with your prompt, be a bit of a risk. Now, the best example I can really give you for that is actually from back-end prompts, where we gave the model some examples of UK language that it should use. And one of the examples was check, QUE, so the noun in British English. And it took that really literally and decided to use it as a verb. So when it talked about to check something, we had QUE, which entertained us all at the time. It showed us that there is a real sweet spot with these. It takes things literally. Sometimes more information is not better information. Sometimes it reminds me of a child in that way. Hallucinations, something I'm sure you've heard of. I'm not going to go into that in any great detail, other than to say that the model, we can never eliminate hallucinations. That's never possible with an AI tool. But what we do is we minimize them. We do a lot of work to really keep them at a minimum. When we say hallucination free, we're referring to the linked citations, which you can and must check. But the outputs themselves, you can never 100% guarantee that a model won't sometimes use a bit of creative license and make something up. Now, if you take the model into a more of a creative space of thinking, it does tend to happen a little bit more often. The last point, basic point, before I show you an example, is that, as I said, the AI does suffer from overwhelm. So we're careful not to overwhelm it at our stage, at the back end. But when you put your prompt in, you need to bear the same thing in mind. And it's something that comes with practice, I would say. In experimenting with this, I've certainly found myself that sometimes putting less in, drip feeding a bit of information to the model, sometimes brings me back something better than if I give it all in one shot. And it's something that you'll play around with. What I'm going to do is show you an example that I ran so that I could demonstrate what I mean. So on the left side of my slide here in the purple box at the top, you'll see that I put quite a long prompt into the model. I asked the model to create an argument, and it was that my client, so I've used a criminal defense example because that's easy for me, acted in self-defense. I've given a bit of a fact pattern. I've told it that it's writing to the prosecution, and I've given it a reason. It's to persuade them to discontinue proceedings against my client. And then I've given it a little bit more. So I've said the injuries were minor. There's my client has no previous convictions. Now, I, as a lawyer, if I was writing this letter, I would know that the fact that it has no previous convictions is not something I would go in hard on. It's a side point, but I certainly wouldn't want it to dominate. So I ran that, and what you see in the black box on the right is what I got back, which is certainly not at all bad. The bit that I've highlighted in yellow, I think, is a really good sentence, quite eloquent, and I really like that. That's helpful to me in this task. But in pink, I've highlighted all the stuff where the model has really gone in hard on that no previous convictions. So I can see that giving it perhaps too much information has led it to skew that argument into something that I didn't quite want. So that I haven't reached my sweet spot here with my prompt. Something else that I notice is because the model's gone into quite a creative space, I don't have an awful lot of law there. I have one link at the bottom, but there's not enough of a sophisticated legal argument for me, for my liking, and there's not really enough for me to check there. So I experimented with removing a little bit. So you'll see the second purple box underneath the first one at the bottom. I've taken out some of that fact pattern towards the beginning, and I've taken out the bit about the previous convictions and the injuries not being too severe. And I ran it again. And although there are some similarities, what I got back here is quite different in some ways. So I've highlighted in yellow the parts that are a much more sophisticated and in-depth legal argument. And in green, I've highlighted the links that it gave me. So I've got a lot more law in there. I've got a case, I've got legislation, I've got a practice note that, although I obviously wouldn't include if I was to send this letter out, I can then check, which, as we know, is absolutely crucial. You don't want to end up in front of me at the Solicitors Disciplinary Tribunal for not checking anything. So what I've got here, I hope this demonstrates and give you something to think about, that giving it less, I've actually got back more of what I want. And what I could then do is drip feed it that extra information. I could say, well, I do want to include that no previous convictions, I just don't want it to dominate. So I can say to it, can you add this? Looking back at the slide previously, you'll see that in my first prompt, I put stress that the injuries were minor and that he has no previous convictions. So in my sort of casual writing of it, it's not ideal because I've said stress, and that is probably why it's dominated. So the model has taken that very literally. So I think unintentionally there, I illustrated my own point quite well by not quite thinking through what I put and giving the model something that's taken it slightly off course. Now, in real life, of course, you would carry on a conversation with the model, you would refine, and you may well take elements of two outputs you've been given and put them together. It's unlikely that you're going to do any editing for something that you get. But what I've got here between those two are something quite creative. I've also got some really good law and some really well-worded legal argument there. And I've got those links, so I can easily click and I can check and I can develop my argument a little bit. So rather than go into the specifics of how to write a prompt, what I've tried to do in this 15 odd minutes is just give you some things to think about. Play around with the model. Try putting more in, try putting less in. Be careful with the words that you use because it does take things literally sometimes. Once you get used to it, the fact that it takes things literally, I think is actually a strength, because you get very used to giving it those very specific instructions, and then you realize that you're starting to get things back that are more what you want. So I think that's a good thing, actually. I think that's all I've got time for. So thank you very much for having me to speak with you today. If you've got any questions, I'll be here.
Thank you, Heidi. I think Kate is going to take over and bring some of this to life for us. Thank you very much for the insights that you shared there. Very helpful and interesting.
Thanks, Matthew. So as a brief overview for those of you that haven't really seen Lexis AI, I just want to give you a bit of context around what our AI tool sort of currently offers. So we currently have 4 different use cases. Of course, we've got many more ideas in development and in the pipeline, but currently on Lexis AI, it allows you to ask a legal question. So looking at those examples that Heidi was just showing us, you can see that you can pose a legal query. We can follow up with additional questions or clarifications. We can interact with Lexis AI as if we're chatting with a trusted colleague who will intelligently and conversationally respond to our requests. The second use case is to generate a draft. This guides you through the legal drafting process, generating the first draft of a legal document or a clause, and you can easily change the tone and identify what amends have been made. Lexis AI allows you to generate client emails, letters, legal memos, contract clauses, and advice. The third use case is to summarize cases. It provides a custom summary of any case law document to help speed up and guide insightful analysis on a case. And the fourth and final current use case is to upload documents to summarize or to ask questions. You can upload your existing documents in order to summarize them or to search within the documents through Lexis AI, so applying those generative AI capabilities across your own content. It allows you to find facts related to a given legal issue and to find cases and statutes that have been mentioned in your documents. Now, what makes Lexis AI different from other AI models is that it's grounded in that LexisNexis exclusive content, from primary law to secondary sources, that practical guidance content, encyclopedias. It's fully integrated with the Lexis Plus platform, and you can toggle seamlessly between the two. Lexis AI excels at providing the most accurate answers to legal inquiries because it leverages authoritative and current content. It uses proprietary search technology integration that allows us to improve responses and to integrate trusted content from Lexis Plus. And we leverage a substantial group of legally trained professionals that continually improve Lexis AI's performance by testing and training it. So that being said about Lexis AI, if we move on to looking at prompts and prompt building construction to look at some tips when it comes to prompt building. So as Heidi has said, and looking at those examples there, before we jump into any AI tool, we need to think about that information that we input into the product. So in order to begin a conversation, we must provide an instruction or a request, providing the AI system with a starting sentence or a phrase to influence the response that it generates. So we're going to move on to looking at some prompting techniques. So we'll look at the 5 different P's of prompting here initially. So the first one being to prime. You need to make sure that you phrase your prompt without ambiguity. Go for a simple sentence structure and be concise, but add as many facts as needed. Think about how you'd explain something to someone conversationally. This also means being inclusive. So again, back to the points that Heidi was making, make sure that you're spelling out abbreviations, you're avoiding using any colloquial language. The second P is to look at the persona. So who is it that you want this document for, this information for? Is it the claimant, the defendant, buyer, seller, landlord, tenant, employer, employee, and so on? By expressly stating this and making it really clear who the information relates to, that will change the output that you receive. The third P is prompt. So make sure you clearly state the task and the expected format of the output that you require. Ensure that you specify your goal and purpose, providing examples if you can. This will help to prevent the technology from filling in any gaps, which could lead to imprecise results. You also need to ensure that you include a jurisdiction where there are regional variations to ensure that you're getting that correct information. Now, the fourth P is product. So what is it that you want? Do you want to answer a legal question? Do you want to generate a draft, a letter, a clause, a memo? What is it that you need? Make sure that you expressly state what the output is that you expect from the AI system and that you're selecting the right use case. And then the final P is to polish. So again, reiterating that information that Heidi has already passed on to you. To refine the result, you need to iterate your prompts. Think of it as a two-way conversation. Some back and forth to reach a shared understanding is to be expected. An iterative process will ensure a more accurate result. You can also add further instructions, such as to soften or strengthen the tone, to simplify, shorten, add further information. You give more and more guidance to the system. So they're the different prompting techniques, both what Heidi's run through and those prompt tips there that I've taken a look at there. I think now we're going to jump into Lexis AI and look at prompt building and prompt construction. So I'm just going to pop that up on screen for you. You should all now be able to see Lexis AI. So we're going to start out by looking at an example here and how we can develop and build a prompt. So I'm going to just start out with ask a legal question, and I'm going to ask Lexis AI, how much are national insurance contributions? I want to know how much those contributions are. Now you'll see as I pop it into the system, it's having a look at the query and it's interpreting that, trying to understand the intent behind the query there. Looking across all of that Lexis Plus content, that grounding content that will back up the response that it produces and give links out into that citable authority. Now you'll see here, now that I've got an answer on screen, it's talking about national insurance contributions. It's giving me some information. It's saying that they vary depending on who it is that's making the contributions, when it is that those contributions are being made. So we really need to give it more information to get that answer that we require. So whilst we've asked how much are national insurance contributions, who for? Is it for an employee? Is it for the employer? And so on. So we can continue with those follow-up questions. So for employees, we can pop that into the box. And you'll see that Lexis AI then retains and understands the prompt in relation to the initial query. So it will answer that off of the back of that initial query that we've posted there. It's not running a completely new question. If we just give it a second for the answer to pop up on screen there, you'll see that it then will rewrite our answer and give us further information. So talking about national insurance contributions specifically for employees, talking about those class 1 national insurance contributions there, with links out into further documents where we can read around and see further information in this area. However, we're getting lots of different information here because obviously the amount of national insurance contributions does vary depending on when it is we want to know for. So if we just pop in at the bottom there again for 2024, we can put that in and it will further refine and give us the crux of what it is that we need. So now it's looking at all of those different elements of the query. So it's looking to see how much national insurance contributions are. It's looking at specifically those employee national insurance contributions and in 2024. And it will give us that more precise result that we require. So you can see here that it's really important that you include all of those clear, specific details that you need in order to get the best possible answer. Now it's popped up to let me know that within 2024, the national insurance contributions for employees is 8% now of your salary, and that changed earlier this year. So what we could have done to make this much more effective, rather than jumping in and popping in all of those follow-up questions, which is perfectly valid, if we'd have stopped and thought about our prompt in the first instance and included all of the relevant information. So rather than just popping in how much are national insurance contributions and asking all of those follow-up questions, instead we could have input that information initially. So putting in how much are employee national insurance contributions in the UK in 2024. And again, Lexis AI will look at the prompt to understand the intent of the query. And when it generates our response, you will see that it gives us that specific answer that we got to after 3 times of trying when creating that initial prompt. So it really is a case of that balance of making sure that you are providing enough information and all of the relevant and pertinent facts that you need to get to the crux of your answer, but we don't want to overwhelm it with too much information. Likewise, you can, by all means, as you saw, just put in a much more vague question and ask those follow-up questions to get to that final point. But by putting in that more precise question initially, you can get there much more quickly. So let's take a look at some other examples here. I'm going to create a new conversation, and I'm actually going to ask Lexis AI if it's raining in Leeds. I'm going to pop that into the system, and you'll see that, again, it's looking at my prompt to try and understand the prompt. And what it will tell me when that eventually sort of pops up for me is that this is not a legal question, that it cannot answer this question In fact, let me just pop that up really quickly there. You can see it's telling us that it's designed to answer legal questions and that this is not a legal question. So it won't just make something up in this instance and give you some random information. However, what we can do, if I just ask it, how much is a banana? It gives me some interesting information. So it can't tell me how much a banana is, but it has some useful information dealing with sort of bananas there, with sort of the market control and so on there, definitions of bananas. But it will give you some useful information in this area if there's relevant information, even if it's not a specific legal question, if there is something in that area. So do make sure that what you're putting in there is something legal and relevant. So let's just pop in a new prompt and we'll put in something that's a little bit more vague so that we can see some further info. So this has been sort of specially requested. So I'm going to pop this one in here. So I'm going to ask, why are slugs and ginger beer important? And you'll see that again, it looks at the question, but it's looking at that question with a legal perspective, through a legal lens. So it's not going to talk about how slugs are an important sort of food source for other wildlife, that ginger beer can be really good, maybe to settle a stomach upset. It's looking at this query through that legal lens. Now, as it takes a look and looks across that content across Lexis Plus, you can see that it's bringing us back, as expected, that information in regards to Donahue and Stevenson, with some further information here with links out into that grounding underpinning content so that we can view the case. We can see some further content across the text, the practice notes and so on to read around this area on why it's important. I'm going to jump back to create a new conversation. And in fact, I'm just going to pop in one more prompt here under the ask a legal question, just to show you that we can put in quite long prompts here. So I'm putting quite a long one here relating to my client who sustained a severe ankle injury. The claimant experts have stated that the client is disabled pursuant to the Disability Discrimination Act. The client has 30 years earnings. The current salary has not changed despite the disability. Now, is there a residual loss of earnings claim pursuant to the Ogden 8 calculation? So there's a lot of information there. But that's all key facts. It's all pertinent information. It's all relevant to the query. We don't have any extraneous material there or any immaterial sort of information as part of that prompt. So we can look at it all and take it on board and use it to produce a query for you there. And you can see it's giving us a really quite detailed response with, again, links out to that grounding LexisNexis content across the practice notes, the text, the case law, the legislation, and so on. So we'll briefly jump into looking at some of the other use cases, and we'll just pop some things up really quickly here. So I'm going to show you generating a draft of a document. So I'm just going to quickly ask it to draft a limitation of liability clause for me. Now, again, we need to make sure that we're including that context so that it's giving us everything that's relevant to the clause that we've asked. So I'm asking for a clause for a pro party B supply of services agreement. So telling it, I do want that draft a limitation liability clause, but I want it for this type of contract, and this is my client. I'm giving them all of the pertinent facts there, rather than leaving it open to interpretation, where it needs to either fill in the gaps or give us an awful lot of information to take a look at. You'll see that again, it then creates that content for us. You can see that we have a summary there, we have the actual clause, it will give us some further suggestions, optional additions, and so on. You can also then change the content here by asking it to soften the language, to simplify a document, and to shorten it, and so on. We can add further instruction in order to amend and change those documents. Just to briefly jump into the other functions here, so if we look at summarizing a case, so I'm just going to pop a case here into the box. And you'll see that when we do that, it will then provide us with a custom summary of that case, making it really quick and easy to read around a case, to interpret it and understand sort of what is important in regards to this case. You'll see that when it pops up, it doesn't just give you a summary of the case, it will pull out sort of the material facts, the key legal holdings here. It will pull out the law that's been referenced within that case and give you the court rationale and the findings. It also will provide a link out into that actual case as well, taking you into Lexis Plus to view your case. So again, we'll just give that a second to pop up on screen for us there. There we go. You can see that's popped up on screen. If I scroll down to the bottom, we then have a link out to view the full text. Now, the final use case that I do just want to briefly touch on with you here, where we're uploading documents to summarize or ask a question. So I'm going to just drag and drop a couple of documents across here. And we can then either ask Lexis AI to summarize the documents, or we can interrogate them and ask questions. So I'm going to ask questions about my upload, and I'm actually going to ask them to compare the differences. So I've uploaded 2 SPA documents, one pro seller, one pro buyer, and I'm asking it to read through, to have a look at the documents and to compare the two. And you'll see that once it reads through those documents, it will generate then a summary pulling out of the key differences between the documents. Now, any documents that are uploaded here into Lexis AI are highly secure, and they only last the length of the session. So if we were to shut it down, or if we leave it for 10 minutes for inactivity, it deletes your document. So it's perfectly safe to put them in there. And here you can see we then have our response here on screen. So the key thing really when prompting across all 4 use cases is to think about what it is that you want. So what is the intent of your query? What do you want out of that prompt, out of that instruction? Are you including all of the pertinent information? Have we put in too much? Do we need to break it down into smaller chunks of questions and ask those follow-up questions on there? Think about things before we input them in there. You'll see that, as Heidi mentioned, the model can actually respond really quite well, even when we don't put sort of the greatest prompt in there, as you saw with that national insurance contributions query. But we can just iterate, ask further questions to refine to get to the crux of what it is that we need. So whilst we keep all of those tips in mind, you can keep on iterating and refining. Matthew, do we have any questions at all?
Marvellous. Well, thank you so much for taking us through that. We have an absolute ton of questions. And I'm going to be honest, there are so many questions, we're not going to be able to answer all of them. As this is about prompting, I'm going to just try and focus on those questions that specifically ask about prompting. If you've asked a product question, can I suggest please go onto the website, fill in our inquiry form, call the phone number. A lot of the questions that have asked are beautiful ones to segue and answer, but we're talking about prompting today, so apologies, we will not answer all of your questions. I think the first one that's come up is about, there's a little bit of confusion about this overwhelm and the concept of overwhelming, and what is too long a prompt? How do we make sure if we complete all of those P's, is there a risk that is going to be too much information? What can AI in general hold? What can Lexis AI hold? And what is too much of a prompt?
Either of you. Heidi, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to go?
Absolutely. I mean, there's no absolute sort of amount that I can give you to say keep it to 2 sentences, for example. It really, really depends on what you want and what you're asking. So, and it sounds a bit like I'm kicking the question away, but experimentation is really key here. One thing that I have certainly found, if we're looking at something with quite a fact pattern, I would not put necessarily the whole fact pattern in at once. I would give it what it needs to bring me back the linked citations and the overall information that I need. And then I would possibly drip feed those facts. If I wanted a letter, like the one I used in the example, if something's a bit less important, I might hold that back and then I might give it to it at the end. So just touching on another question that sort of overlaps that I saw in the chat, not to answer it completely, but does this sort of make us a bit defunct if the model is doing the thinking that we would do if we went out to that library and bring it back? No is the short answer. It does some of that work for us, some of that initial interpreting of the sources, but you can never take what you've got there and say, right, this is everything I need for my client. It's bound to be more nuanced, it's bound to be more refined, and you do need to check things, because sometimes the model will come back with a confident answer to your query, but perhaps there's a bit of nuance in there that it's either misinterpreted or that you haven't given it. And it's a good answer, but it's not quite the right answer for your situation. So I would really caution against sort of thinking that the AI is going to do that for us. It's not. It helps us on the way. It helps us to go to what we need more quickly, I would hope, but it's certainly not going to do that job for us. So when we're putting that prompt in, asking for a situation for our client, it's not that we are sort of putting ourselves in the shoes of the client. It's just giving us a helping step onto putting together our advice for that client.
Yeah, absolutely. Your legal expertise is still absolutely required here, and you need to be checking and looking at those citations and looking at the links. How we like to really position it is more that it's like your starting point. So rather than having to run a query, say, across Lexis Plus and put that information in and wade through an awful lot of documents, because the wealth of content on there is amazing, and you will find practice notes, you'll find textbooks, journal articles, cases, legislation that are all valid and relate to that query that you're posing. The AI assistant will give you that bit of information to start out with, and then link you out into all of that sort of verifiable grounding authority that sits around it. So by no means is it taken away from your role and what is expected from you and what you will do sort of as fee earners. Absolutely not.
Thank you. We got quite a few questions about jurisdiction and about how we can prompt to focus the model to talk about jurisdiction. Now, obviously, Lexis Plus AI is sold in different countries, and the model we're talking about here is here. But perhaps, Kate, do you want to talk on about jurisdiction, the limits of Lexis Plus AI that we're selling here in the UK, and what the jurisdictions are?
Absolutely. So Lexis Plus AI UK is focusing on the UK jurisdictions, so UK and Northern Ireland. So you can ask questions about any of the jurisdictions across the UK and Northern Ireland, but you must specify that jurisdiction. If you do want to look at jurisdictions further afield, then obviously, as Matthew mentioned, we have other products in other jurisdictions. We would recommend that at that point, that's when you really want to be looking at the Lexis Plus platform rather than Lexis Plus AI. It will only answer any queries for the UK Northern Ireland jurisdiction, but you can pop in that specific jurisdiction and it will give you that information. So for example, if we were looking at something like, for example, collective redundancy, where that does extend across sort of the majority of the UK, so the law is broadly similar across England, Wales and Scotland, but it is quite different in Northern Ireland. So we can specify that we need to know about that process in Northern Ireland, and it will give us a very different response to what it would give us for that question for sort of the rest of the UK.
Super, thank you very much. A couple of questions about the length of the prompts and perhaps the efficiency of doing so. Would you advocate creating little prompt libraries, for example, of the sort of prompts that you know work, or actually is it best to write it from scratch every single time?
That's a really good idea, actually. Yeah, if you found some wording or a flow, a conversation that has really worked for you, especially if it's sort of within your practice area, so you'll be going back to it, you can then adapt those. Yeah, that's a really interesting idea to keep those. If I have a conversation with the model where I've really got what I wanted, I will make sure that I've saved that conversation and I'll go back to it. If you can find a more formal way of doing that that works for you, that sounds good to me.
Super, thank you. I've got another question about how people were surprised about the short prompt for summarization. And do you think that there's anything extra that should be added, or any limitations? It was just a very simple, you just put the name of the case and you tell it to summarize. But maybe is there anything more that you think might be added there, or is it all the back end prompting that does the hard lifting there?
So on that use case to summarize a case, it's all there already. And all that use case will do is summarize a case. So you can simply put in sort of the case that you want to summarize. You really need to specify your citation. Otherwise, if something has progressed through the courts, if there's been multiple law reports that have been made for that case, then you're leaving it open to interpretation, and it will tell you there are multiple reports for this case. This is the one that I've picked. This is the one that I'm summarizing, which does tend to be the most recent instance of the case in the neutral citation. But you don't have to give it any further instruction other than either just the citation or the case name and citation, and everything else is done in the background at that stage.
Super, thank you. I'm very conscious of coming to our last minute and everyone's going on to go, but there are some really good questions here, so I apologize if I haven't answered them. We will try and find some mechanism to respond, because I think there's some really insightful points. Perhaps I could just ask Kate and Heidi each in turn, what is your top tip for someone to take away in order to be a better legal prompter through an AI system?
Heidi, do you want to
Do
go?
you
Do you
want
want me
to
to go
start,
first?
Kate?
I
Why
don't
don't you
mind.
start?
I'll go. Absolutely. I don't mind going. So I think the key thing is making sure that you sort of think about the information that you input in the first instance. And thinking about that balance between not providing enough information and giving all of the clear facts, and not putting in too much. So not giving all of that, immaterial content there. Make sure that you keep it really concise and really crisp. It can still be long. You can still have, extra facts in there, but it still needs to be concise and straight to the point of what you want to include in there. Everything has to be pertinent to the answer that you want to receive, as otherwise it can influence or confuse the AI assistant if we include sort of too much information or things that aren't really relevant or pertinent to what we want to find.
Thank you. Heidi, what's your final big tip?
Well, it's hard to pick just one, but not to kind of reiterate anything I've already said. I think I would say, as much as possible, use the correct terminology. I think we all have, I know we did in criminal defense, we have sort of phrases, sort of almost colloquial phrases for things. And the model can deal with these really, really well. I'm surprised how well it can deal with it. But if you can use the actual terminology, you've got a much better chance of getting back what you want. So just be careful about the way that you're phrasing things. The more specific you can be, the better.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much to Kate and to Heidi. Thank you so much for your time. This material will be made available. It's going to be quickly edited up and will be pushed out to all of you who have attended and anyone that registered wanting access to it. So that probably clears a good third of the questions that have been asked. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you enjoy your lunch break, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.